Good evening. Thanks for coming out. Welcome to the third annual symposium on wildness, wilderness, and the creative imagination. I'd like to take this moment to recognize our sponsors. The College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Writer's Block, Committees on Lectures, the Iowa Arts Council, Departments of Philosophy and Religious Studies, LAS Miller Lecture Fund, the Bioethics Program, Department of English, the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, the Wallace Chair for Sustainable Agriculture, Department of Geological and Atmospheric Sciences, Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology, Departments of Environmental Science and Environmental Studies, and Ames Collegiate United Methodist Church and Wesley Foundation. I have a few announcements to make. We have a fantastic raffle that's still going on this evening. $1 per ticket enters you into an opportunity to win some fantastic organic Lozier bacon. So see these folks in the corner for that. Tomorrow we have two fantastic field trips, one to Ledges State Park and another one to Onion Creek Farm. And the Onion Creek vans will be leaving at 12:45 at the west side of the Union. The Ledges bus will be leaving at 1 o'clock p.m. also on the west side of the Union. And there's plenty of room, and there are sign-up sheets in the corner as well for that. It's a great opportunity.
And then the bus going to the cider is at 3:45.
3:45 bus to the cider. Okay. Over here we have books from all of the authors that you've seen for the symposium, and we have fantastic folks at the flyaway table patiently waiting back here. There are still some Gary Snyder and Linda Hogan collectible broadsides for sale, so see the flyaway staff for those. Following James Pritchard's lecture this evening, there are going to be some cookies and punch, and soon thereafter we are going to repair to the Campanile for the Patrick Hazel performance, and that's one that you won't want to miss. Evaluations, if you would take a moment to fill out a program evaluation, we'd appreciate it. Those are available in the corner as well. You may have seen walking in our mapping project, and so this is fun. Take a pin and place it in your favorite place in the United States, in Story County, and or in Ames, Iowa. Let's see, is that it? Okay. Ohio native James Pritchard received his master's degree in history from Montana State University and a PhD in environmental history from the University of Kansas. He's currently an adjunct assistant professor at ISU, where he holds a split appointment with the Department of Natural Resource, Ecology and Management and the Department of Landscape Architecture. He's the author of Preserving Yellowstone's Natural Conditions, Science and the Perception of Nature, co-author with Randy Beeman of A Green and Permanent Land, Ecology and Agriculture in the 20th Century, and with his wife, Diane Dubinsky, of A Field Guide to Butterflies of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. His periodical publication topics are as diverse as the work of Paul Irvington and Iowa Prairie Cemeteries. James has spent time as a social studies student teacher in New Zealand and a ski bum in Utah's Wasatch Range. But he made his real environmental bones while working as a Bozeman, Montana-based technician for Shell Oil in the Rocky Mountain oil patch. James is a keen cyclist and triathlete and an advisor for the ISU Nordic Ski Club. This winter, he completed the Mora Vasaloppet 30-kilometer Nordic ski race. This afternoon, I tried to arrange a kick and glide cross-country ski duel between James and Bill McKibben, and Bill McKibben got wind of it and skipped town. Todd Wilkinson, the Take No Prisoners environmental columnist for the Christian Science Monitor, says this about him. James Pritchard has established himself as one of the premier observers on the often perilous collision course between science and politics. We're lucky to have James here at ISU and the third annual Symposium on Wildness, Wilderness, and the Creative Imagination. Please welcome James Pritchard.
Thank you. That's a very kind introduction. It's good to be here, and part of this symposium that's celebrating wildness and wilderness and wild writing. And I've got to tip my hat to the grad students who are enrolling in this program in creative writing and the environment. And I'm with you 100%. This project got started last summer. I started writing, and this was the journal that I had in mind, the Wapsipinicon Almanac. If you don't know it yet, you really should get acquainted with it. It's a really beautiful publication from Anamosa, Iowa. It's full of beautiful essays, and it impresses me that the writers here, as well as all the people advertising in this journal, the businesses, the artisans, the artists, they're all doing what Bill McKibben talks about in his book, Wandering Home. They're trying to imagine new ways of inhabiting this landscape with sustainability in mind. And so that's where this tonight's presentation got started, with this essay. And then, of course, came along the symposium and this wonderful book, Home Ground. And so most of the words that I use tonight are found in Home Ground. And it's really a wonderful book. It's alphabetical, which helps me find the words. And it's just really neat to find out more about all these terms that you already thought you knew everything about. So, without further ado, let's get started. And like all good stories, this one starts with, once upon a time, my wife and I moved from a college town in the mountainous west to the Great Plains. And sometimes I think I've been adjusting ever since. After 12 years living on these plains and prairies, you'd think I might have completed this transition and made peace with this landscape, my prairie home. You might think that by now I'd found my home ground. You might think I would just say simply, I really miss the mountains, and just get over it. But we are academics. This bears examination. I find myself still wondering about the essential differences between living in the West and living in this vast interior of this continent. My analyst tells me that I'm making good progress, and he looks forward to our next meeting. Along the way, I learned 2 languages for 2 very different landscapes. Using these languages, words describing the landscape is part of inhabiting a place. In naming the features, we start to feel like we know the place, and we start to make some sort of a claim to a landscape as our home ground. As Barry Lopez writes in the introduction to Home Ground, what many of us are hopeful of now, it seems, is being able to gain a sense of allegiance with our chosen places, and along with that, a sense of affirmation with our neighbors that the place we've chosen is beautiful, subtle, profound, worthy of our lives. I was born and raised in the Midwest, a suburban child viewing life, from the windscreen of an automobile. But in 1976, the West lured me into its embrace. My Uncle David taught me how to ski up in Michigan, in the hills of Michigan. And then, of course, I guess when you're young, that's not quite enough. So then you have to go find longer and bigger ski slopes. And so I moved out west, and I learned the language of the western landscape. And the first dialect of this language that I learned consisted of words used, first of all, by mountain, just the mountain environment, and then by mountaineers. So the word mountain, we learn in home ground, means a place that rises up. But it's more to it. There's more behind this word. And it implies a certain majesty. Right away, you think mountain, majesty. And on a sunny day, Mount Moran in the Teton Range sure does look majestic, but come back on a rotten day when it's really rain and fog and 20 below, and maybe it might look a little less majestic. Mountains, of course, are formed, and you'll see drawings like this all throughout this book, Home Ground. Here's a fault, and many mountains are formed in this way. You've got two massive blocks of rock that are slipping against each other. And of course, when they slip, you might feel a tremor or an earthquake. But this is one way the mountains are formed, by faulting. This is a fantastic example of a fault. Again, this is the Teton Range looking south, and this is Zoe paddling her log on Jackson Lake. What's so interesting here is the 4,000 feet of elevation from the lake surface to the peaks. That is a majestic example of a fault. And every year the mountains grow, but by a fraction of an inch. But actually what's really going on is also that the floor of the valley is also dropping. So they can go either way. The other word here is shockingly missing from Home Ground. I swear it's missing, is the word hole. This is Jackson's Hole. It's a rather large-sized valley. And it's delineated, it's separated from other places by the mountains nearby on either side. So on this side is Jackson's Hole. On the other side of the mountains is Pierre's Hole. Well, who's Pierre? Well, these guys were fur trappers back in the 1820s, and that's how they claimed their home ground. There's lots and lots of language that goes along with mountaineering and these mountain landscapes. One of them is avalanche chute. And I define an avalanche chute as some place you don't want to be. Up here, these steep couloirs and these steep avalanche chutes, when the mountain warms up in the middle of the day, that's when they start to shed snow. And another thing they'll shed right off is rocks. And so if any mountaineer, if their route would happen to take them up someplace like this, they'd want to do it at 6 a.m., very, very early in the morning, before the mountain warms up and starts to shed snow and other things. So avalanche chute. Buttresses, walls, ramparts. Much of the language of mountaineering is the language of the castle, and a buttress is a rather large portion of the mountain, and hence it deserves a bigger term. So buttress about covers it. It's a rather huge chunk of the mountain. One of the most interesting things about this photograph that's taken out of a climber's guide is the idea that climbers not only talk in terms of difficulty. So a route going up the east face of so-and-so peak, it'll be rated 5.7, 5.9, goes free, aided. All these are terms of difficulty, technical difficulty. But also, mountaineers are also interested in aesthetics. And so the direct route, or the directissima, straight up one of these buttresses, that's considered a more aesthetic line, a more aesthetically pleasing thing to do. And so this is something that's to be desired. Gendarme is a beautiful word. Like many of these other words, it comes from the French, and the golden age of mountaineering occurred in the French Alps, and so many of the terms, like gendarme, this notable pointy rock, come from the French. This is from a book called On Ice and Snow and Rock by Gaston Rebouffet, a famous French climber. And that's Gaston right up top. And we used to drool over these books and think, oh, if we could only be as good looking as Gaston. And he, always wearing this sweater and a small rucksack and really sheer exposures, really photogenic stuff. So that was the dream, to be like Gaston. This photograph is also interesting for the glaciers depicted here. We always used to say, if you want to climb the ice and snow, you got to put up with the weather, which means snow, clouds, fog, grotty weather where you just don't go out because you get lost up there. So there's a zone of deposition up top, and when you get heaps and heaps of snow, it'll turn into neve, N-E-V-E, and then it turns into ice, and with enough weight and pressure, it starts to turn plastic and it literally flow down the mountain. And that's the wondrous thing about glaciers, is that they are flowing down the mountain. Until, of course, Bill McKibben invented global warming, and now they're going the other way, they're receding. As the glacier descends over rock formations and goes down the mountain over the rocks, you can imagine this plastic surface opening up and opening crevasses, holes in the ice. And some of them, you can tell this would be really hard to walk through, so the object is to go around it. Many of the terms of mountaineering become navigation clues, and you're trying to find the easiest way up to the top. Up here, the real danger is that some of these crevasses are hidden by snow, and they're called snow bridges, and you can fall in rather easily. I did it once. It's no problem to fall in to a hidden crevasse, but like when you're up there, every party is always roped. And so don't worry, Mom, we know what we're doing, and we're self-rescuing, we can get out. Here, from Home Ground, is this kind of schematic of a glacier, bringing us to a couple more mountain terms. This is a cirque, which is formed by a glacier up in the mountain, carving kind of a big horseshoe-shaped circle up in the mountain with rock head walls. And if you got two glaciers on either side, what you might end up with is called an arête. It's a knife-edge ridge leading to a summit, like so. Another interesting thing about the glacier country is that all the rocks that are falling off this wall fall down onto the glacier here, and so then the glacier will carry them along. And this is called a lateral moraine. You'll be out there on the ice and you'll say, where did all these rocks come from? And gee, they're in a pile, and it's a long pile, but it's only 50 yards wide. And what happened here? And then you'll learn more about it and you'll figure out that's what was happening. And then if another glacier comes in, a lateral moraine becomes a medial moraine. And here is the terminal moraine, where the glacier is pushing rocks out. And now, over the past 50 years, many of the glaciers, for example in Glacier Park, are now in recession. And so you'll see a long pile of rocks out in a glacier outwash plain. And you wonder, how did that get there? Well, it was the glacier, when it was advancing, pushing those rocks out there. Here's another word, hanging glacier. These are the hanging glaciers way on the top, and the cliffs are so steep that the glacier is pushing out, but it doesn't flow down the mountain. It's so steep that they just drop off. Here on Mount McKinley, we were near this spot one day when one of those hanging glaciers actually did cut loose. It was about 2 miles away. For about 2-3 minutes, we were so scared. It was very scary. Big wall of seeming avalanche headed right for us, but it was just the wind of the avalanche. John Krakauer wrote many of the entries here for Home Ground, and he's been to Everest and he writes all about this, and he would call it the wind of an avalanche. It's just a powder and it's just a dusting, but it was certainly scary at the time. Which brings, all these mountain terms bring us to the word summit, the holy grail, the elusive, sought-after object of endeavor. This is the summit of Denali, or Mount McKinley, just over 20,000 feet. This is myself, only because Mr. Bill, my partner, was the better photographer. Notice the Shell Oil hat. This is the view from the summit. And this leads us to a crucial question here. Why these climbers would spend 18 days getting to the summit and then It's only 6 degrees below zero and calm. It's a really nice day. And 18 days up and then spend 10 minutes on the summit and turn around and go down. Why would anybody do this? Is a question that clearly, ladies and gentlemen, requires more research. There's some contradictory notions involved in mountaineering. One of these is the idea of freedom of the hills. In fact, there's a book by a similar title. I think it's called Freedom of the Hills. It's a technique guide to glacier travel, etc., etc. And so that's indeed what we're seeking out here as a wilderness experience, the freedom of the mountains that we get by climbing. And yet, at the same time, McKinley was a mountain where you followed the rules or the mountain would kill you. We witnessed a long train of grim-looking rangers coming down the mountain one day, and they were carrying out 2 Swiss in body bags, and they had cooked inside their tent. And so, while you're seeking that freedom, at the same time on a thing like Denali, it was a very serious business, and we obeyed all the rules. Another interesting thing that this photograph makes me think about this view from the summit is, remember how Bill McKibben last night was talking about hyper-individualism? And there's plenty of room for that among mountaineers. Talk about type A personalities and overachievers. Oh boy, plenty of room for that. There's plenty of room to stretch yourself and go for that wilderness experience. My friend Mr. Bill was always stretching himself and pushing himself. I was a lot more comfortable. He wanted to go, the hard way where we wouldn't see anybody else. I was a lot more comfortable with the easy way up the mountain, the most popular route. And there's something about society, being in society, even in a remote and wilderness place like Denali. I kind of liked that, especially given the dangers that we were looking at out there. What kind of home is reflected in this language of a mountain home ground, a mountain playground? Home ground might be a playground, but home is where you recoup. Home is where the bathtub awaits. The second dialect of Western landscape language that I learned was from the world of work. This is a book by Rick Bass. It was called Oil Notes, which I read back in those days. It was a beautiful account from the view of a petroleum geologist. He was a petroleum geologist. Wait, hold on. Rick Bass. Isn't that the guy who writes about the wilderness of Montana? The Yak Valley, wolves, bears, same guy. Now you know where he got his literary start. He used to be a petroleum geologist. And he would talk, those guys are interested in things like this, synclines, anticlines. Again, most things like this are from home ground. These are fold mountains. And what geologists are looking for, they send out an oil exploration crew like I worked on, and you explode a small charge of dynamite. The energy goes down and reflects off these layers of rocks down under the ground and comes back up, and you capture that energy with measurement devices. And that takes a second, literally, just a second for that energy to bounce around. And they're particularly looking for domes. They don't know what's under there, but they do know they can measure, about where those layers are. And then they have to guess what's in under there. So they're looking for these domes. That's where oil is often found. Many people find Wyoming really dry, but when I was walking around Wyoming, measuring that energy bouncing around that landscape, I fell in love with Wyoming. I loved it. To me, it was stunning and beautiful. This is a particular place in Wyoming. It's kind of green. This is July, but there's a little river down in the valley there. And actually, this is near Split Rock, which is a marker for pioneers as they went west to Utah. They were looking for this particular rock to guide them on their way. Basin and Range is the title of a book by John McPhee, where he describes the work of David Love, who was a geologist who did the geology of Wyoming. And Basin and Range really does depict Wyoming. Basin and Range, repeatedly across the state. The basin here, and then the range of mountains in the distance. That really does epitomize Wyoming. The third dialect of the Western landscape language that I learned was associated with my PhD dissertation, my research on Yellowstone National Park. And Yellowstone is really interesting because if you walk 10 minutes from your car, you're in the wilderness. You are really totally away. And it does have those wilderness qualities, but at the same moment, it's one of the most mapped out and well-known landscapes. Probably because we love Yellowstone, and so everybody wants to know it. These guys, including the park historian, went out and they mapped out all the waterfalls in Yellowstone over 6 feet. Not only that, but they named anything that was unnamed yet. And so this represents this very well-known landscape. M, we learn in home ground, is for mud pot. And the technical definition for mud pot is a really neat place with boiling mud. It's, for many people, it's the wildlife inhabiting Yellowstone's landscape that really grabs their attention. I'm always impressed that people are really thirsty to see wildlife when they get to Yellowstone. Even a few elk will cause a 10-minute traffic jam. I wrote in my first book, wild animals, those entities Farley Mowat called the others, in a fundamental sense have symbolized nature for generations of visitors. For millions of citified tourists, travel to Yellowstone has become a pilgrimage to see nature itself. It's fun to speculate that animals see things that we do not, and they perceive the landscape in very different ways than we might. Here's a map of wolves of Yellowstone, and wolves have a very keen sense of their home ground. They know where their home ground, their home turf is, and they know where those limits are. And they separate themselves from the other wolf packs. Each color here is a particular wolf pack here. Scientists know this because they've radio collared many of these wolves, and so we know exactly where they are and generally what they're doing. Another creature that we know a lot about in Yellowstone, and that's really interesting to scientists, is the grizzly bear. And one thing we know from radio tagging these creatures is that the males of the species have a much more extensive home ground or range than the females do, which I found to be a really interesting fact. And so I do have some spare time, and so I was in my office, and as I so often do, I had this brainstorm, and I thought that I would share with you tonight how I'm going to revolutionize our understanding of landscape perception by gender across species using sophisticated GIS techniques. That's Geographical Information Systems. So landscape perception by gender across species. So we have, wolves, we have bears, but how about humans? Here's a map of Ames, and the outline in blue. And here is a female home range. This is my wife's running route. When she goes out to run, I put this satellite, transmission device on her ankle, and she kicked me upside the head, but I finally got it on there. And so she went out running, and that's her track, is done by GIS techniques, and they don't lie. Compare that to the guy. Here's, when I go out for exercise, here's my route, tracked by GIS. Yes, a much more extensive home range, conclusively demonstrating that across species, guys have a more extensive home ground. I wish that the scientists in the back row there would quit glaring at me. So the sample size was 1. So I used a bicycle. Let's not let scientific method get in the way of creative writing. Now we have a Western landscape with named features. And yet these landscape terms do not convey the feeling of the sun burning your skin, the big empty sound of silence, sometimes a sort of hum, ears that can't get used to hearing almost nothing, and the smells of these places. Air, sound, smell, It's all very much a part of our experience of a place. Clean air seemed abundant in the Rockies. In the late fall, my friend Marty the foot doctor and I would roll down the windows of his old red International Harvester pickup, and we'd bump up a forest road, drinking in the scent of the lodgepole pines. We felt like we were out on some frontier, the edges of civilization, as we traveled over the gravel roads and the rolling foothills. Strangers driving by in the opposite direction would give a casual wave. It was a greeting that let you know that if your old engine went kerflooey, you'd have to wait a while, but you would certainly get a ride back to town. It was reassuring. It made you feel like you were at home. Of course, living in the West involves some mythology and some self-delusion. All of us coming from Ohio and Chicago and everywhere else, we brought with us the traffic problems that we had thought we had left behind. And so as we all tried to get out to the wilderness, we noticed, a lot of other people out there. And so in the early 1990s, I noticed that people stopped waving. And that's noticeable, that I would notice. But it was clearly noticeable that people had stopped waving. One day I said, gee, I haven't seen anybody wave in a couple of years now. What's happening? You couldn't tell if people were really from Bozeman by their license plate. They might be from California. And so there's more rude jokes about Californians, more rude jokes about land developers. And so eventually, when people stopped waving, that cozy little mountain home just seemed a little less cozy. In 1991, Diane and I moved from Montana to Lawrence, Kansas. Our friends looked at us as if we had some very unusual illness. You're moving where? Implicit was the larger question, how can you possibly leave this wonderful and spectacular and beautiful mountain playground? How could you do this? And after 3 years in Lawrence, we came north to Iowa. During these moves, I've had conflicting feelings about living in the Midwest, about returning to the Midwest. What do people do in a flat place anyway? Why aren't there more hiking trails? We went to a public hearing for the Tallgrass National Prairie Reserve, now in Kansas, and somebody was protesting this idea of a Tallgrass National Park. They said, we have plenty of trails in Kansas. We don't need any more trails. Why? We have 5 miles of trails in this state park. And we were shocked. 5 miles. This is just the beginning if you're in, Colorado. That's just the access. How is it that these people in the Midwest appear content? Like many people, we initially failed to appreciate the finer qualities of this landscape. And that brings us to an important question tonight. Why do people overlook the Midwest? There are 3 principal reasons, I reckon, involving history, the very nature of a subtle landscape, and identity. In 1785, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, and maybe there's just that background germ of a cultural notion that this landscape ordinance made it much easier to buy and sell land. And so maybe that ease, maybe that land as a commodity that is easily bought and sold, maybe that's the germ of devaluing a landscape, perhaps. But for our purposes tonight, there's some really interesting stuff going on in this diagram showing the Northwest Ordinance. An acre is the amount, traditionally, it was the amount of land that a plowman and a team of oxen could plow in one day. 640 acres make up a section, and in Iowa we see that very visibly on the landscape, don't we? These sections marked by the section line roads. It's very visible. One writer recently called this the grid. Now, here's a really interesting word from the book Home Ground. Boustrophodonic, which answers this question. Why are the sections in a township numbered so weirdly? Look how they go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they turn around. 7, 8, 9, 10, and then they turn around again and go up. What is up with this? Well, boustrophodonic means turning like oxen in plowing. And that's why townships are numbered like that. History. When Congress created Yellowstone National Park in 1872, part of their thinking incorporated a landscape ideal of sublime beauty, of awe-inspiring beauty. At some point, our culture started to look for nature in very unusually beautiful places. In 1916, when the National Park Service was established, only the crown jewels, Yosemite, Yellowstone, Glacier, only those were considered as worthy of inclusion in the national park system. Only in 1996 did we add the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas. One of the best results of recent criticisms of the wilderness idea is the notion that nature is not just out there in Yellowstone, but nature is all around us. It's right out our back doors. People overlook the Midwest because it really is simply a more subtle landscape. Nature doesn't jump out at you here in the Midwest. Some of these places, like the place where I was born, can seem unremarkable. I think the kids know that it's remarkable. We used to play down in the 10 Mile Creek, more properly known as the Ottawa River. But it seems like a really sad legacy that today we have these warning signs and kids are not supposed to play down in there due to the toxic pollution. So maybe these seemingly unremarkable landscapes seemed like we could ignore them as grown-ups, and we thought, well, we can just, it doesn't matter. I think kids know better. So the Midwest may seem unremarkable, but I'm lecturing to the choir here. We know better. The future of conservation and the future of life-giving sustenance at a national and even global scales will be found in these seemingly unremarkable landscapes. Here is your task, English majors, poets, artists, ecologists. The public discourse needs to be more conversant with the language of landscape, the language of this home ground. People really need your assistance in seeing the remarkable amidst what seems mundane to the untrained eye. As Barry Lopez writes in Home Ground, something emotive abides in the land, and it can be recognized and evoked, even if it cannot be thoroughly plumbed. It is inaccessible to the analytic researcher, invisible to the ironist. Third, people overlook the Midwest because of something to do with identity. Westerners have lots of identity, and of course lots of that's mixed up with mythology. This is Buffalo Bill, Je viens, I am coming. This is from a publicity poster in France for the Wild West show. Cowboy hats are a great example of identity in the American West. Plop a cowboy hat on your head, voila, I am a Westerner. The Midwest, I think, could use a more developed sense of identity, and part of that lies in learning and publicizing the language of our home ground. And there is romance in this landscape if we could just look for it and dig it out. What we are doing is recognizing values in this landscape and bringing them to people's attention. We are placing value, we are assigning value to the landscape. We could go around the room and list 100 things that we love about Iowa, but we want to kind of keep close to our theme, home ground, and think about some of the landscape terms that I learned with my second language of landscape, the language of my prairie home, which I learned partly by living here and partly by taking advantage of really local opportunities to do some research. First of all is the term lowland. It's amazing, really. Have you played poo sticks lately? Well, tomorrow you can roll right down to the creek there and stand on the bridge and throw your little poo stick into the creek or river. And although that stick is going to travel 1,000 miles to the Gulf of Mexico, it's only going to drop 600 feet in elevation. This whole place here in the middle of the continent is low. Instead of wishing for a mountain, what I need to do is embrace the low. We have some excellent guides for describing and knowing our home ground. Here's one of them. It's called Reading the Landscape, now out of print by May Watts. And here's one of the images from her chapter called Prairie Plowing Match. It's really interesting to think about. Here's Mesoamerica on the left there, the maize, and then what we have down that fence line is 1 foot of Illinois or 1 foot of Iowa. Those are the native species that are still there that never got plowed up. And out here in this grassy place, dandelions and everything else that came in was imported from Europe. This is the language of native species, exotics. This is the language of botany. And it's fun to learn. And this is, of course, a very highly fragmented landscape. I probably don't need to tell you that less than 1% of the native prairie, that original habitat, still exists here in Iowa and in the state of Illinois. A high-quality prairie will have hundreds of species of herbaceous flowering vegetation. And so there are a few fragments left. The matrix, however, has been turned to corn and soybeans, the general picture of that landscape. One of the really interesting places to learn about prairie, to see prairie, and to find small patches of prairie that were never plowed up are in pioneer or prairie cemeteries. Here is the Rochester Cemetery near Iowa City, and it's absolutely wonderful. There's approximately 87 species of native flowering plants here. And much of the cemetery is kept in native prairie, although there are tombstones scattered throughout it. And then some of the prairie here has mown paths that are mowed on a regular basis to the more active part of the cemetery. And to me, this is it struck me, and I published a small piece in the Iowan about prairie cemeteries. And I said that isn't this a wonderful opportunity to honor, our own dearly departed, our human memories, but also the prairie heritage, the botanical heritage of Iowa. After all, it was that prairie that made the soils, that made the wealth of Iowa. This is a crowd I think that we really shouldn't ignore. There's a rage going on in gardening circles. They're planting prairie plants, and they're very interested in a restoration of native habitats. And so we see some pretty big installations of prairie species here in Iowa and around the Midwest. So these gardeners are not to be ignored. Some other terms from the Midwestern landscape. Wetland. And a wetland is, but I'm going to stop right there, because if I start defining wetland, then we'll be into policy, and policy gets a little complex. We'll be into federal law, and really we don't want to talk about that right now. Let's use a different term. Let's use M for marsh. It's a richly evocative word. It used to be used quite a bit, more than it is today, maybe because many of our marshes have disappeared. You can tell if you're in a swamp or a marsh if you look down at your feet, look down around you. If you see trees, you're in a swamp. If you see sedges, you are in a marsh. Here is a muskrat house from home ground. The muskrat is a really interesting little creature. Before the fur prices dropped in the 1980s, over 1 million muskrats were trapped every year in the Midwest. And I don't think they were over-trapping. I think that's the mark of a remarkably, productive ecological system. Paul Arrington was a scientist here at Iowa State University. He studied muskrats out in the marshes of Iowa, and he wrote this. Glacial marshes comprise their own form of wilderness. They have their own life-rich genuineness and reflect forces that are older, much more permanent, and much mightier than man. Arrington saw wildlife values in marshes. He saw wilderness in marshes, and he saw human values in marshes. He wrote this in Of Men and Marshes. My memories of sunsets are not confined to marshes, but it has been on marshes that I have been aware of some of the feelings coming nearest to complete peace of mind, which I seem capable. I'd like to propose a creature feature for the Midwest, a critter to exemplify Midwestern values, an animal we can all be proud of and look to for inspiration as we search about our home ground for signs of wildness. Bear, otter, rare bird, maybe a cougar. Nah, these are too showy. They lack the personal restraint that typifies real Midwesterners. I propose the freshwater mussel, a really nifty critter. This one is the fine-lined pocketbook. Okay, so maybe they're not affectionate with humans, but they do have an unbelievable reproductive cycle. Some of them, a few species, have lures, and they'll lure in a fish. And when the fish comes near the mussel, they'll release their glochidia, their larval form, which latch on to the gill of the fish. You quickly can understand the rest of this story. The fish swims far, far away. 21 days later, to the day, depending on the species, those glochidia now are junior mussels, and they drop off to begin their lives as mussels way up the river. They were known to every child in Iowa who ever waded a stream in the good old days. They were ubiquitous. They were everywhere. There was a big industry based on mussels in the Mississippi River that turned mussel shells into shiny shirt buttons. So they were widely known. And today, you can still see these mussels out in Iowa streams if you look. Not as plentiful as they were, but you can literally see their tracks in the sand at the bottom of the river if you go canoeing. So look for that the next time you're out there canoeing. I always thought they just stayed in one place, but they don't. They actually travel along and leave these trails. If we could describe the terrain of our backyard rivers using words like sandbar, this must be where mussels refresh themselves. Mussel bed, that must be where mussels sleep at night. Yeah, we'd be more familiar with our home ground. And here's a word from home ground, meander. And this author in Home Ground gave me the notion that an energy river is an energetic system. It's full of energy, and the energy that it's not using is being absorbed by the landscape in a meander. Terry Evans, a beautiful photograph of Kansas and a meander scar. And sometimes a river will cut off in a flood stage. It'll cut off an old meander, and it'll turn into a meander scar, the first place to fill up with water in a rain event. Nowadays, our family, we go back to Wyoming every year, and Phil Cousineau, in his book, The Art of Pilgrimage, writes, "Have you ever imagined yourself in a place that stirred your soul like the song of doves at dawn? No crashing cymbals, just a quiet cooing." I think that not only the object of our pilgrimage, but also our homes can call to us in this way. And so we go out to Wyoming every year, and we spend 4 to 6 weeks out there. Our children, bless their little hearts, think that this is normal behavior. We plunk ourselves down for 4 to 6 weeks at a scientific research station. And as we go, the children have their kind of a linear home ground out on the highway, and they have staked out their home ground, and they know where the best playgrounds are. M.J. Anderson writes in Portable Prairie, "Ahead of us lay all the discomfort and strangeness of a journey, that thing we do to ourselves simply because it is necessary to go and see, and because no one is ever fully reconciled to home." So it's work that takes us out to Wyoming. My wife chases butterflies, and my job is to think great thoughts. It's fun to chase butterflies. One, it's simply fun to do. Secondly, when you chase butterflies, we become immersed in the landscape, and we become more attuned to the rich biota, to the comings and goings of all these small creatures. Third, for a scientist, watching butterflies is interesting because you can chart out the path of global warming as these habitats in montane meadows are affected. The species composition changes. And of course that would be true here on the prairies as well. And so we develop these languages of various home grounds. But how do we know when we've arrived home? As much as knowing the landscape, as knowing the language of landscape helps you feel at home, it remains an intuitive sense that informs you in a very quiet voice when you are home. Indeed, as we've spent time here in the tallgrass country, our family has come to feel like we are on home ground. Even having moments, as M.J. Anderson put it, when we feel wrapped in the deepest enchantment we know, which is the strange familiarity of home. As our family drives east every summer, coming back home to Iowa, we notice it about halfway across Nebraska. It's that 100th meridian where you start to feel the humidity. And despite all those mean things that I've said about humidity, I've started to finally embrace the humidity. And when we feel it, we start to get kind of itchy, and we're ready to get home. So that's this green is a thing that we really notice coming home. We really are impressed every year coming back at the fecundity of the landscape, the rich biota of this ecosystem of the Midwest. This is from the Carver murals here at Iowa State University. Here, George Washington Carver has been turned into the tree of life. And so it's this miraculous, life-giving quality, this rich productiveness of the Midwest that strikes us every time we come back. We need to reimagine our landscape. And so this is kind of an introduction to that idea. Let's reimagine our landscape, and let's help other people reimagine the landscape of the Midwest. What would a future green and permanent land look like? That's what Rexford Tugwell, an agricultural reformer in the 1930s, that's what his vision was. He wanted to see a green and permanent land. What would that look like? I think we still have the same, goal today. There's people that are going to help us imagine a green and permanent land. This is Tony Thompson. He's a ridge tiller, uses ridge till techniques on his corn and beans down in southwest Minnesota. And this is Tony, not outstanding in his field, but outstanding in his wetland. He is an unconventional kind of guy, posting signs like this: a river-friendly farmer lives here. He's got 200-foot buffers around the wetlands on his property. And his family owns 2 prairies that were never plowed, 80 acres each. He gathers the seed from these and plants them on his buffer strips. And he got in trouble with the NRCS. He almost didn't get his farm bill payments because the farm bill calls for like an 8 species mix. Well, he was planting 80 species that he had collected off his prairie, so he almost couldn't collect. Big trouble. But he made it. So he's going to help us imagine, and he really will, because he gets other farmers to come out to his place and take a look around and talk about ecology and talk about farming. I had a little photo contest, and Jim Pease, you win the apple pie, the grand prize for the photo contest. Here is what I think the future landscape might look like. It's a landscape that's no less productive, but you see a real more mixture of uses, woodlots, orchards, whatever these different agricultural uses might be. But it's a much more mixed landscape, which is also good for wildlife habitat. These are the last 2 slides, with which I'll conclude with a couple of ideas. There's 2 people in the Natural Resources Department who have been wandering around Iowa and asking nosy questions of farmers. And what they thought was, they were asking farmers about their most cherished memories of living a life in a rural area. And they thought that these farmers would talk about the biophysical aspects of the landscape. Wrong. The farmers invariably, almost, talked about themselves in society in a rural landscape. They talked about their fondest memories of rural life was that their neighbor got sick, and so they helped out with the harvest. So they feel very, very connected to other people. And I think that's a really important idea. And something there, indeed, there is something about society as we think of home. In Portable Prairie, M.J. Anderson writes, "To be among one's own kind, to be so thoroughly and deeply recognized, so like the others. Is this not what we mean, after all, above all, when we speak of home?" I had been in Iowa for about 6 years, and one fine day I decided to get out of town and take a drive in the country. Tootling along at 42 miles an hour seems pretty darn fast if you roll down the windows and contemplate the feeling of skidding along the gravel on your bottom at that speed. I mean, you could do that if you fell down on your bicycle. I edged over for an old pickup truck that was approaching me, and then the strangest thing happened. A guy actually waved at me. Instinctively, in a flash, I raised my fingers off the steering wheel in greeting. There it was, that moment when people recognized each other as fellows. Got a problem with your radiator? Let me give you a lift to town. Fellows, living at the edges of civilization, fellows in the very midst of the heartland, surrounded by everywhere and nowhere. In a moment, I had arrived home. Thank you. Thank you very much. Questions, comments?
I can't find that word in the book about the oxen going up and down. What is that word?
Boustrophodonic. Boustrophodonic. I said it. Wow. It's on page 320. Boustrophodonic.
Couldn't imagine the spell.
Yeah, Boustro. Boustrophodonic. That was a tough one. I couldn't memorize it. Yeah, Fritz.
On one of your earliest slides, the picture of some mountains, and there was a horizontal line of snow, not very wide, that went the whole range of the mountains.
Bergschrund. And that's a major obstacle, because often you're looking at like a nice clean face, except for that darned Bergschrund in the way, and it'll be a step of 15 feet vertical ice, and it's a real pain to get past it.
Is that where two land masses have slipped relative to
Well, I think you got this vertical face of ice, and so that kind of ice kind of sticks there, but then you got this sharp bend, and so the ice kind of has to twist and get into a horizontal position there, and so I can't quite figure it, but yeah, there's this huge gap there quite often. And so, yeah, you saw that stretching clear across.
There are Marines in Iowa, too. And I like to just drive across the landscape and see if I can identify where the Marines are. And there's quite a few along Highway 17 in County.
Yeah, there's ancient glacial history in Iowa, and you can see it out there if you know where. Yeah, how to look, how to read the landscape. Yeah.
So how do you see your children developing their home ground? I think they will be attached to a certain place? Or?
Yeah, I wonder about that. I wonder if they'll, say, I was born in Iowa, and really become attached to Iowa. That could happen, and there are worse things that could happen to a person. So, yeah, I think traveling in other places sure makes me appreciate Iowa more. I was just in Detroit last weekend, and boy howdy, Iowa is good. Yeah, Joe.
Your slide of the alternative agricultural landscape at the end.
Yeah.
Do you see any place else that anybody's developed that idea a little bit more, or have other examples? Or I think of that a lot, what Iowa could look like if we thought about agriculture differently.
Well, I think I whacked a few more slides. I've whacked about 30 slides out of this. to get in a reasonable length. But buffer strips, I had to whack the pictures of the buffer strips. They are rather remarkable things. You can filter out a bunch of atrazine in only like 5-10 feet of buffer. It's amazing how fast you can filter out nitrogen, phosphorus, even atrazine, and you can surely filter out a lot of sediment, soils out. And so I think this current interest in buffers is a really good thing, and so I see a lot of buffers stretching across the landscape.
That picture of the alternative agriculture didn't have Westmoreland sprawling.
No, I didn't. I didn't have any folks living there. Right, no sprawl.
Do you think that sprawl is helping to develop a home ground for some people that, because they have these 2 and 3 and 4 acre lots?
Well, I heard Bill McKibben say rather mean things about suburbia this morning, so I'll let him handle that. I think there's delusions. Suburbia is eating up prime farmland. I think that's the biggest problem with suburbia, and as the price of oil just keeps on going up, maybe people will start again, looking to live a little closer to town, and you'll see some infilling, I would imagine, eventually. Suburbia does present challenges. Yeah, but it's that old English landscape ideal. That ideal of having your own home on a plot of ground and, green lawn. It needs to look like this. It needs to have a lawn and look like this. That, certainly cultural notions contributed to suburbia as much as the easy availability of oil. Yeah.
So James, you're a child of suburbia. I am a child of suburbia. I drove Bill McKibben to the airport, and you should have heard what he had to say about Anchor. But I have to ask you, is it possible to develop the language of a home ground in a suburban environment, in a suburban community? It sounds like you feel like you did that. Do you think that is a next step for American communities?
I see a golden future for suburbia, and it's I call it Velo Ames. Bicycles. I think people are gonna, when the price of oil gets to $10 a gallon, they'll drag that old bicycle out of the garage and dust it off, and put new tubes and tires on it, and they'll start biking. And little shops will spring up. Little local supermarkets will again be able to make it because you can only pedal so far for a gallon of milk. And so I see. Yeah, suburbia in some ways is really neat. Bill McKibben this morning was saying how it hides things. You can't see where your water comes from, et cetera, et cetera. But suburbia is also very, very beautiful. It can be, and there's no reason why we actually have to pollute all our rivers. That river where I grew up is interesting because it goes further on downstream. It goes past these big estates. So the owners of the Willie's Jeep factory that was polluting the river up, over there, finally the toxic pollution comes home to those grand old estates. The pollution finally came home. Suburbia is not dead. It's there. It's there, and we're going to have to deal with it. So sometimes I really despair, like in Detroit last weekend. Boy, I got bummed out with all the cars and traffic. And sometimes I think, we need an alternative transportation system. What will it be? And then I realize, as I ride my bike, this is it. It's here. It's the road for my bicycle. It's here. And with that provoking question,
time for punch and then the Campanile.
Punch and then the Campaniles. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. I appreciate it.